In 1964, Pontiac would launch a vehicle that would help touch off the muscle car craze across the American automobile industry, and that was the 1964 Pontiac GTO. In its inaugural year, the GTO was just an option on the Tempest that one could order, and when you did check that box, you got the larger 389 cubic inch V8 under hood. Basically, the big V8 from the full-size Pontiacs dropped into an intermediate-sized car. Until this point, the largest V8 that you could get in the Pontiac intermediate-sized vehicle was a 326 cubic inch derivative of Pontiac's V8 that was a smooth runner and a great performer. But it just wasn't enough for the performance crowd or John DeLorean, who was by then Pontiac Division's general manager. And so he, along with marketing boss Jim Wangers, derived this GTO and put in a standard 389 cubic inch V8 that made 325 horsepower when topped by a 4-barrel carburetor, or 348 horsepower when topped with 3 2-barrel carburetors. The GTO went on to be successful and was produced for a number of years until 1974, when the GTO was just a shadow of its former self and was kind of let go unceremoniously after that year. At this point, Pontiac knew that performance was largely dead, and the division had started rotating a few years earlier toward increasingly luxurious trends. In particular, in 1971, Pontiac introduced a new range topper, the Granville, in this regard, as it tried to push itself up market and improve and boost division profitability, knowing full well that the performance era was coming to an end. It was coming to an end for a number of factors. One was forthcoming emissions regulations that were going to rob power from engines, and engineers by this point didn't know how they were going to get the same amount of horsepower out of engines as they were, especially when they needed to run on unleaded fuel. The second reason was just from an overall cost perspective. Insurance companies had caught on by this point that sports cars and their drivers tended to operate their vehicles more recklessly. And so insurance premiums for sporty vehicles became much more expensive than regular vehicles. And that pushed up the cost of ownership for sports car owners, helping curb overall sales. And thus the GTO began a slow and steady decline from around 1970 till 1974, when it was basically just a gussied up Pontiac Ventura that really didn't look like much of anything. Now, the GTO name was dead for a number of years, and many people will recall that it was reborn in the early 2000s when GM's vice chairman Bob Lutz brought a Holden from GM Australia, rear-wheel drive coupe, to the United States and rebadged it a GTO and sold it in the United States. It was really a Holden Monaro, and it was only produced from the 2004 to 2006 model years. In 2004, the GTO came with a 5.7-liter V8 that made 350 horsepower. 2005 and 2006, it came with a 6-liter V8 that made 400 horsepower. The car really never caught on in the United States, in part because it really just didn't look anything like the GTO from the earlier years. And so individuals who had owned those cars weren't really attached, or let's say their interest wasn't piqued by that rebadged Holden Monaro. Prior to the Holden Monaro, though, being rebadged as a GTO, there was a concept that Pontiac released in 1999, this orange Pontiac GTO concept that certainly had a lot of what designers would call boogie, and maybe too much boogie. Pontiac obviously had its so-called guardrail styling during these years with the ribs, and you can see the designers overemphasize them on this Pontiac GTO concept. And the car even had some design cues from the GTOs of the past, including that hood-mounted tachometer and a bit of a Coke bottle shape to the rear. But this was never really intended to be a production car. In fact, the show car was just a roller. It didn't have any engine in it or transmission. It was just kind of pushed on the stage. So that tells you how serious Pontiac was about producing it. In any case, there's that 1999 GTO that I mentioned. There's the 2004 to 2006 GTOs, and of course the 1964 to 1974 GTOs that many people remember. But did you know that Pontiac actually did a design study for the GTO different from these in 1988? Well, here it is. Now, what's interesting about this 1988 GTO concept or design study is that it really has some of the same issues associated with it that one could attribute to the subsequent GTOs that came after it, namely that it doesn't look anything like the GTOs from 1964 to 1974. This has a far more athletic proportion, much lower hood and cowl, as well as an aerodynamic shape, and that upper portion is really almost a glass canopy, or at least designers are trying to disguise it as such because the A pillars, the B pillars, and the C pillars are blacked out. And you'll see in a second when I show you the rear three-quarter photo, it is a significant amount of glass in the upper. I would also characterize this as one of those 1980s era GM designs where the overall shape is the design. There's not a lot of feature lines on this car, if hardly any at all. It's really the overall form of the automobile exemplifies its design. Something similar to the Buick Riata. There were a number of these so-called no-line cars that GM was putting out during this time frame, and that was because designers were trying to get away from that really boxy kind of three-box design that you would see on the X cars, for instance, and to something more modern and athletic. Here, they do have the Pontiac twin-port grille, but it's almost just disguised in that lower portion of the fascia, and I suspect that this hood opens perhaps from the windshield and then forward, because notice where the cut line is for the hood. So I suspect this was a hood design similar to the C4 Corvette. Now, from what little information I could find on this 1988 GTO concept, it was based on the Chevrolet Beretta L-body platform, and so it was, as a result, front-wheel drive. And this was during a time frame when many automakers were evaluating whether or not their sports cars should be front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive. The Ford Probe, for instance, was going to be the Mustang, but ended up being a separate design and vehicle altogether. Nonetheless, it is an interesting design, though it doesn't resemble a GTO at all. I do like that it has this very subtle shoulder. Notice that radius that's about halfway down the driver's door, and it continues all the way back and also into the front fender. Also, one of the issues with these so-called no-line cars is that the body sides can end up looking rather chunky and puffy. And so this GTO has a design feature that was employed to minimize that, and that is this blacked out section that goes all the way around the vehicle. That serves to minimize the visual height of the car, or at least the height of the body sides, and again, make it look more lithe and athletic in appearance than what it really is. I do like the funky dual wiper design on the windshield as well. Not quite sure what's going on there, but certainly cool. And here's the rear three-quarter view of the same concept. Notice that super glassy upper, again, very trendy of GM 80s era design concepts, similar to the Cadillac Voyage as an example. That rear backlight goes all the way to the full wraparound tail lamp, and that would never become really a Pontiac hallmark. But, well, Pontiac did have some illumination in the rear, in some cases, like on the later Fiero GTs, where the Pontiac logo would light up, and even the Sunfire, although on the Sunfires, Pontiac was only illuminated, I believe, by one bulb, so it really looked like Antia instead of Pontiac. You can also see Pontiac embossed into the lower portion of that fascia there in a logo that would continue for many more years. So clearly this was not inspired by the GTOs of yesteryear. It does have some nice overall proportions and styling. I like the distinctive shoulder here that you can see the light breaking on the top of that shoulder that continues from the front of the car all the way rearward. I do also enjoy the wheels there with the black hubs. It's kind of a distinctive design that I believe Pontiac would introduce on some vehicles in the future after this. But long story short, this GTO concept, similar to the other GTOs that came after the 1974, really just didn't say anything GTO about them. Can you imagine this coming out as a front-wheel drive vehicle with this styling labeled GTO in the early 1990s as an example? I don't think it would have resonated, but what do you think? What do you think of this overall design for this 1988 Pontiac GTO concept? Something that was worthy of production, or something that was not. Thanks again for watching.